let's distinguish between risk and odds. So first, some things to remember. First, probability is what we want over the total possible things, right? So 3 red pens out of 40 pens total, 3 over 40. Odds in favor of something happening are the number of favorable outcomes over the number of unfavorable outcomes. And risk is the probability of an event over the probability of a different event. So really we're comparing two events. A lot of times event A will be like an experimental group and B will be a control group. So we can compare the two. And that gets us into the values of relative risk, right? So remember that risk is a ratio of two probabilities. If the relative risk is between 0 and 1, that means the event is more likely to occur in the second group, which is the denominator. And this should make sense. If we divide two numbers and we get a number less than 1, that means the top number is smaller. Now, if the relative risk is equal to 1, right? So the numerator and denominator are equal, that means the event is equally likely in either group. And if the relative risk is greater than 1, that means our numerator is the larger number. And so the event is more likely to happen in the first group. Now, what does that really mean? It means that a relative risk of 70%, which would be 0.7, right? 0.7, so that's between 0 and 1, means the event is 70% as likely in the first group as the second, which means the second group is more likely. That's the denominator. A relative risk of 120% would be 1.2, right? Greater than 1. It means the event is 120% as likely in the first group as the second. So it's more likely in the first group, which is the numerator. All right, let's look at this. Using the table given, what is the relative risk of not catching COVID for those who receive the booster shot? So we're looking at not catching COVID, and we're comparing the vaccine and the booster to the vaccine only, right? Remember, with relative risk, we're comparing two groups. So we are trying to find the probability of no COVID with the booster, because that's what we want to know, right? Did not catch COVID. So no COVID with the booster over the probability of no COVID with the vaccine only. So the no COVID with booster, no COVID, 398 over 410, because we're only talking about those with the booster. The no COVID with vaccine, so we're only looking at vaccine only. That's the 233 over 300. So now let's put that into a fraction. So we've got the 398 over 410 all over 233 over 300. Well, when we're dividing two fractions, I can write that horizontally. It's 398 over 410 divided by 233 over 300. And we know to divide fractions, we're simply going to multiply by the reciprocal. So 398 over 410 times 300 over 233. And that simplifies to be roughly 1.25. And now you're thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, 1.25 is the same as 125%. So remember, it is greater than 1. Our relative risk is greater than 1. So the people who received the booster were 125% more likely to not get COVID. That's what that means, right? So with the booster, they're more likely to not get COVID. That's the relative risk. That's what that tells us. Okay, so now let's find the odds ratio of not catching COVID for those who receive the booster. So the odds a person with a booster does not get COVID is 398 to 12, right? Because not getting COVID is what we want. So 398 comes first. Those that got COVID are after. Someone with just the vaccine, well, those odds are 233 to 67. Okay, well, the odds ratio is comparing the two of these. So now we're putting the odds 398 over 12 all over 233 over 67. Again, we turn this to a horizontal division problem, so we can multiply by the reciprocal. And 398 over 12 times 67 over 233 gives us an odds ratio of 9.54. And now, again, you're probably thinking, well, what does that tell us? Well, the odds ratio tells us people who got the booster had 9.54 times the odds of not getting COVID as those who only had the vaccine. So both the relative risk and the odds ratio show those that had the vaccine and the booster had much better odds and a much better risk of not catching COVID than with just the vaccine only, based off of the table we were given. And that's odds and ratios and relative risks.